We're just going to give people a couple more minutes, and then we will get started. So welcome to Peter White Public Library. All right, we're going to get started here tonight. Welcome to Peter White Public Library. My name is Marty Acketts, and I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator for Peter White Public Library. And I'm really excited to have Lynn Domina here to do her book launch reading from Killing Me. She's read from it a couple times in a few different places during the Great Lakes Poetry Festival, but I'm really excited for you to hear the rest. I've read the book. It's fantastic. So I can't wait for Lynn to get up here and share her work with you. Excuse me. There's a couple things that I'll make you aware of that are upcoming this week and next. This coming Wednesday, 6:30 p.m. right here in the community room, we have the wonderful Phil Lynch, who's going to be doing a concert, and the concert is called Songs That Bring Us Together, and he's going to be playing some, he's going to be doing some covers and also some original songs. So Phil is always I should stop knocking this. That's dangerous when you do that. Phil is always really fun to listen. Okay, come on back. Ooh, well, it'll come back. We did this earlier. Here we go. Anyway, so Phil is always lots of fun to listen to, and always puts on a good show. So that's this coming Wednesday, 6:30 p.m. And then this Friday, we're going to be showing a movie right here in the community room starting at noon, and that will be Lee Chang-dong's Poetry, a really, really wonderful South Korean film about a woman who develops an interest in poetry when she gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she's taking care of her grandson at the same time. Really, really wonderful film. And then next Monday night, we're starting a new thing called Dinner and a Movie. And for this one, it's going to be Gladiator 2. So if you have not seen Gladiator in a long time, I suggest that you watch that before you show up on Monday night. And that's going to start at 5:30 p.m. because it's a little bit of a longer film. So bring your food. We will have tables set up. You can sit and watch and have dinner, and I'll make some popcorn. And it's for those of you that came to Patterson, you know it was a really good time. So that's Dinner and a Movie this coming Monday at 5:30, starting at 5:30 p.m. And we do have our June schedule out. And of course, in June starts our really one of our most popular series, which is our Concerts on the Steps series, and that's going to be starting the second week of June. And the second week of June, we have Troy Graham on the steps on the second Wednesday of June. So lots of great things coming up. I think I'll do a little bit of an introduction, but I think most people here and watching probably know Lynn Domina. Lynn Domina is a professor at Northern Michigan University. She's published several works and collections of poetry. She's going to be reading from her latest, which is Killing Him, and her book previous to that, which I highly recommend to anybody, is Inland Sea. It's just a beautiful, beautiful collection of poems. Lynn is also the poetry editor of The Other Journal, and does lots of other really cool things that she can tell you about if you want. So please give a really warm Peter Way Public Library welcome to my friend Lynn Domina.
Thank you all for coming out tonight when you could be doing so many other fun things out in this warm weather that we're so unfamiliar with in Marquette recently. Do you know if this will come back on, Marty?
It should.
Okay, there we go. So what I'm going to do, I'll talk a little bit about how this book came to be. It's a kind of unusual sequence of events. And it's, in part, it's responding to some artwork. And I have here, I have this slideshow set up to just loop. And so you'll be able to see a lot of the mosaics that, one of which is on the cover, that the poems, in part, are responding to. So what happened was, many, many years ago, I took a class on women in the Old Testament. And for our final project, we, among other things, we each had to choose a figure from the Old Testament and do some research. And we had to include a visual image in our final project. And at that time, I was writing about Queen Esther. And so I discovered these mosaics by this artist named Lilian Broca. She's a Canadian artist who lives in Western Canada. And she's, at that time, had done a series on Eve and a series on Queen Esther, and she was just finishing up a series on Judith, and she's subsequently done a series on Mary Magdalene. And these are huge mosaics. They're, several feet wide and tall, so they're not just the little kind of 3x5 ones that we might be more accustomed to seeing. And they're gorgeous. They're really gorgeous. And so I was very intrigued with these. And then, so I did my paper and I turned it in, etc. And then a little while later, I had published a poem in a periodical, and that periodical did little very brief interviews with a lot of their contributors. And one of the questions was, if you could collaborate with another writer, who would you want to collaborate with? And I said, well, actually, I'd like to collaborate with this artist named Lilian Broca, right? Time passes. Out of the blue, probably a year and a half later, I get an email from Lilian Broca saying, gee, would you like to work on something together, right? Now, she lives in, as I said, Western Canada. She's a visual artist. I have no training in art. But she had an exhibit of the Judith mosaics in Toronto, at a gallery in Toronto. This was around the year 2016. And so it was in the summer, so I drove over, and I went to this gallery, and I saw all of these mosaics. They had all of them there. And what was really cool, especially for somebody who doesn't know anything about art, is she also had the, what artists call the cartoon, the sketch. And you could see where it had been divided into thirds, and you could see how she was designing where all of the components of the image would go. And so that was really interesting. So I saw this exhibit, and then I came home, and over a period of time, I wrote these poems in response to three things. The story of Judith, which comes from the Bible. Now, if you are unfamiliar with it, don't feel too bad, even if you feel like you know some things about the Bible. If you look at a Protestant version of the Bible, the book of Judith is in the Apocrypha. In the Catholic tradition, it is just part of the Old Testament. But it doesn't get a lot of attention. But in this story, Judith's town of Bethulia is under attack from the Assyrians, and they're starving them out. They've surrounded the city, and they're starving them out. And Judith, who by this point is a widow, suggests, why don't I go out to the enemy encampment, and I promise you, by the end of my visit, we will be victorious. So she does. And this general, Holofernes, assumes that she's just coming there to save her own skin, and he's going to get what he wants, and he's this big, powerful guy. Well, she permits herself to be seduced, and he gets very drunk, and she decapitates him with his own sword. And then she takes his head, and she has her maid with her, and they've brought this bag along. She takes his head, and she puts it in a bag, and they walk back to Bethulia and bring out the head and put it on the ramparts facing the soldiers the next morning. And so the soldiers see the head of their general and flee, and her town is saved. So that's the story. So part of the poems respond to the story. Some of the poems then also respond to the art. And then some of the poems think about what it's like to be either the viewer or the reader, right? So that was how I was conceiving this project. And I was also thinking a lot about form. And so in the collection, there are several poems in various received forms, but there are also several poems in free verse, but they approach that freedom differently from each other, right? So that's all that was kind of going on as I was writing the book. So I got the poems done. And then I thought, okay, now what, right? Because publishing a chapbook is a different kind of process than publishing a full-length collection. Many poetry publishers only do full-length collections. Some publishers only do chapbooks. So there was that complication, but then there's also the complication of the content. How many people are really going to be attracted to this story, right? So I had set it aside, and then Ronnie Ferguson called me up one day in thinking about his press, Harvard Square Press, and said, do you happen to have anything? And I was like, funny you should ask, you know. So I did, and then I wrote to Lilian Broca and asked, could I perhaps use an image for the cover? And she said, yeah. I was like, oh my God. So that's how the book came to look like what it looks like. So I'm going to read several of the poems. The first one is a prose poem, and it is a bit of a sarcastic retelling of the story. So if you're not familiar with it, you'll be both familiar with the story and with a little bit about my attitude by the end of this particular poem. It's called A Bedtime Story. Once, a woman walked away from Bethulia, her maid following only slightly behind her. They felt weak, almost limp, for they had eaten very little for many days, and they'd swallowed only sips of tepid water. Their neighbors curled up in their beds, faint with starvation, as the women possessed not even breadcrumbs to scatter, marking their way back. People said the first woman was beautiful, her dark hair braided with shining beads and wrapped around her head, her dark eyes bottomless as the sea. What they said was true. But it was also true that the maid held her own beauty, though few had ever noticed or given her crystalline beads for her hair or kohl to daub her eyelids. The first woman, whose name it turns out was Judith, carried a bundle tied with string. Inside the bundle, she'd folded her favorite woven gown, dyed to resemble the sea that lay at the bottom of her eyes. Her maid, whose name no one remembers, for who would ever remember the name of a maid, carried only an empty sack, perhaps hoping to return with souvenirs. After a time, they reached an encampment of their enemies. Now Judith was smart and sly as well as beautiful, though men seldom noticed her intelligence or suspected her cunning, for they were too stunned by her beauty and immediately began conniving, every one of them, how to capture her for themselves. So many powerful men suffer from paranoia, and the others, like the general who welcomed Judith, are monumentally gullible. He was reasonably handsome, it is true, and powerful enough to command wealth as well as other men's envy. Some would say fear, but so few men confess to fear. What other reason could a woman have for entering his tent but to enjoy his grilled meat, his sweet cakes, his bulky company? Judith had her reasons, alas. For every sip of wine she tasted, he guzzled a goblet. Let this be a lesson. Drunkenness makes a fool of any prince, warrior, kingpin. The general fell into a stupor, as drunken generals will, his limbs heavy with slumber, his beard thick with drool. His heavy sword hung half in, half out of his scabbard. Judith, never one to miss an opportunity, drew it toward herself, its leather hilt warm within her palm. Her own arms bulging, she brought his sword down, struck him with a single blow, watched his neck split, his blood spurt onto her hands, forearms, the tent walls. She never touched his face, raising his head instead by his coarse hair. She raised his head, then lowered it into her maid's bag, and the two women left as they had come, walking across the desert, entering the walls again of their own town, raising his head again in the night, in the sight of his enemies, and then raising it higher to face his own approaching soldiers. They approached no farther. They ran, in fact, away from the woman they'd all desired. And Judith? She lived, along with her maid, for many years more, quiet and occasionally bemused. So that's my version of the story, with a little editorializing that you won't find in the Bible. So next I'll read a couple of poems, one focusing on Holofernes, one on Judith, and one on the maid. So this is called A Failure of Imagination. If he were vain of his appearance, if he were indifferent, if he oiled his hair and felt it glisten, if he permitted it to descend into knots, each strand twisted around another, he never imagined a woman, clever as that one was, and knowing more than he knew of desire, dangling his head by his black hair, his black beard drooping, stained black with blood. I think the rest of them aren't quite so gory. So if you've ever written like a series of poems or prose, you know that there's a point at which you feel like you've used up your material. What do I do now? I don't have enough work, right? So there comes a point when you have to go beyond, in this case, beyond the story itself, and imagine what else might be going on with these characters. So this next poem, it's called Judith Considers the Letter H, and it's really, it really reveals how a poet thinks, right? More perhaps than how it reveals how a woman these several thousand years ago might have thought. But here it is. Judith considers the letter H. Lowercase, a chair she shuffles to slouch into. Uppercase, a latched gate, guarded, a shield or raised hand, a sentry shouting, halt. At home, mother hesitates, whispers to orchids, sells forsythia from her market stall, treats the Sabbath like a shelter from all weather. Father harvests wheat, hunts for sheep gone wild, wakes shaking from dreams of whales, elephants, shrieking hyenas, their teeth so much heftier than his own aching molars. Even challah is too tough, even hot cross buns. She herself chooses sourdough or honey graham, shortcake with cherries, huckleberries, or lychee in season. She'll whip pheasant eggs into quiche, sprinkle in chives or whatever herbs lie handy. She'll blanch spinach, poach chicken, roast squash or kohlrabi, chop potatoes for hash. She's every mother's helpful daughter, every mother-in-law's hope. However, she chronically thinks, weighing one choice against another. However, whose good daughter could hack his head off so unflinchingly, could so relish her recollection, heaving the blade, his name, Holofernes, pitched from her mouth, his name begun with that breathy consonant, roughly matching the digraph finishing hers, Judith, roughly, though still so far from faithfully matching her. So I thank you. I tried to use the letter H in as many different ways as it can be found in the English language, and I'd be willing to put some money, I don't know how much, but some money on the possibility that there are more H's in this poem than any other one written in English. We'll see. Okay. So the next poem is called Lost Fragment from an Interview with Her Maid, and it's what's called a haibun, which is an Asian form, and it has a passage of prose followed by something, loosely at least, like haiku. And here there are several words at the end that are not in English. Actually, just three. One's in Hebrew, one's in Greek, one's in Latin. They all translate to the word maid. Lost fragment from an interview with her maid. You ask me what I thought then. I thought what I think still, to keep custody of my eyes and lips. If my mistress wraps fig cakes in coarse cloth and packs them in a sack with leavened bread and passes the sack to me, I accept it. If she drains oil from a jug into a flask, if she chooses one skin of wine among several, I accept it. I carry what she hands over. Trailing a step or two behind, I nod when she murmurs. No, I never complained of fatigue or hunger. nor did she. One doesn't. When did I understand what she'd done? I knew when it was proper for me to know. Of course she was beautiful. Doesn't your story say so? Doesn't it describe the men's eyes, how they were enticed? You ask me what I thought, what I felt. You, with your language's fine distinctions between servant and slave. I thought I would carry her bag if she held it toward me. If not, I would not. Now you say my name remains unrecorded. So it is. Na ora, abra, ansala, maid. The reference there about the distinction between servant and slave is because in I think all of the biblical language, but certainly in Hebrew and Greek, it's one word, and it's up to the translator to decide whether to translate it as servant or whether to translate it as slave. We see this in our own American history. If you read much Southern writing especially before the Civil War, many Southern slaveholders would not use the word slave. They would refer to these people as their involuntary servants. So we retain a little bit of that kind of attention to language. So I'll turn now, this next poem is the poem from which the title of the collection comes, and it is, it's in the form of a ghazal, which is a Persian form, and it relies on the repetition of a word or phrase at the end of each couplet, and it also requires a rhyming word just before that, so you'll hear it. And then the most fun part, I think, the most fun part of a ghazal is it's couplets. But in the last couplet, the poet is supposed to refer to themselves by name, if possible. All right. So if you happen to have a name that is a word, so for example, a couple years ago, I had a student whose name was Faith Chase. And every time I took attendance, I was like, what a great name for a ghazal, right? But Domina can be made into other words also. And so sometimes I use Lynn when I write ghazals, sometimes I use Domina, sometimes I use playful versions of those names. So this is called Living by the Sword. He offered figs and honey. She accepted, sweetly killing him. They flirted in his tent, no attendants to avert her from discreetly killing him. He relied on might, dismissed wit, trusted wine to win her consent. She nodded, smiled, obediently killing him. He preferred fine silver, heavy goblets, roasted meat dripping blood. She folded her linen napkin, neatly killing him. She smiled at his jokes, though slightly, gazed into his glazed eyes, fingered his lips, smiled again before genially killing him. With wine and more wine, he grew boisterous, bold, and vulgar, his words slurred and profane. She raised his sword, obscenely killing him. He was a general, she a mere widow. He thought her shy, fearful, submissive. She thought herself sly, womanly, meekly killing him. Who dominates now, the drunken warrior or the threatened woman? Does violence stain every victor, even one famous for cleanly killing him? So now I'll read a couple that are considering the experience of the viewer or the reader. And so this next one is kind of describes my experience when I went to the gallery and saw all of these mosaics hanging around. The gallery they were in was circular, so you just walked around and saw them all in sequence. And I suppose if you have a lot of training in visual arts, your experience would be very different from mine. But I wanted to really under mosaics like this. So the poem is called Learning to See. I followed the exhibit counterclockwise, then clockwise, intrigued by sketches and acrylics flanking the mosaics, art revealing its artifice. I saw how the artist divided her image into thirds, how Holofernes stretched his arms across the panel, mindful of symmetry. I saw how Judith's thrust sword marked the midpoint, how each of the gray and white and brown squares, the tesserae, I learned the word, were cut not identically, but similarly. I bought the catalog, studied the process until I understood everything, mesh substrates, heavy panels set against the glass, oxides enhancing each color's shimmer. I understood everything, except how she took a story I'd heard and heard, recoiled against, dismissed, and stopped my breath with its splendor. So this next one brings us to the present, to our own lifetime. It's easy to dismiss many of these stories as, well, that was a long time ago, right? But really not so much. So this one is called Letter to Judith After a Century of War. This is how we kill people now. A man squats inside a tank, watching burkas float toward him. Sweating in his fatigues, the man follows them along the sightlines of his weapon. The first refuses to stop. She might or might not be holding her son's small hand. She might or might not understand his captain's English. Her burqa might or might not drape over a bomb strapped to her waist. She hasn't yet committed any sin against the man, who had never traveled east of Oklahoma until 3 months ago, but she might. She keeps walking, and he squeezes a trigger, and she crumples onto the road, her burqa soaked now with blood, though he can't see it against the black fabric. Her son, if he walks with her, dies almost as quickly. We've learned other ways, too. Our own bombs, police, our own adolescents entering school. I admire your choice from afar, a story in a book. I admire your bulging biceps in portraits I've seen, your determined brow. Some days I tell myself, the man you murdered got what he deserved. Some days, maybe murder really is the best of all bad options. But truthfully, I just don't believe it. Testimony to my ethics, or to my easy life's easy choices. This one is called Mosaic. Magnified, sand resembles mollusks. Spiraled turret shells, milky stones, a transparent nautilus, the small bones in my inner ear. Heated, sand melts thickly into glass, liquid flowing so slowly its waves won't crest for centuries. Minerals transform clear glass into teal, ultramarine, saffron, this radiant emerald. The small square feels solid between the artist's fingers as she centers it in her mosaic. The flash of a woman's scarf brilliant against her brown skin and the desert night. So I'm going to read two more poems. This next one looks at several versions of paintings of this event. And as you can imagine, it's a favorite event of especially Renaissance and earlier painters. And so many paintings, probably almost any major museum in the world will have at least one painting of Judith killing Holofernes. So this poem is called His Head, 3 Paintings and 1 Mosaic. Giorgione, 1505. His decapitated head so oddly serene beside a patch of weeds, her foot pressed against his hairline like she's Mary crushing the serpent's skull. Galizia, 1610s. She grips the knife a foot or so below his chin and pointed straight at it. She'd kill him again if she needed to. If she needed to, she'd kill him and kill him and kill him. Gentileschi, 1614 to 1618. He'd seen what was coming, but not soon enough. We can't quite tell if her sword has cut entirely through his neck, but his wide eyes can't believe retribution could befall him. Broca, 2012 to 2015. He's sleeping the sleep wine encourages. Her forearms flex sturdy as a soldier's as she hoists his sword, both hands gripping its hilt before those arms heave it down. And then the last poem I'll read is the last poem in the book, and it considers the role of the artist. And I suppose I should say that while I was writing these poems, as violent as some of them are, I balanced it out. I was also writing some poems about Gandhi. So I think I'll be returning to perhaps a more pacifist orientation for the next little while. But this last poem, is called The Artist at Rest. If she were a she-bear, she'd dream all winter of northern lights. Closing her eyes now, she watches colors mist inside her shut lids. Her desire to lie still forever, is it surrender or sorrow? Formed of glass, she'd remain transparent, a prism oscillating in sunlight. If her shattered body converged as constellation, who would notice the hawk? Who the hare? But if she were composed of light, would it feel more fine to distill herself into a single ray, or to be reflected blindingly from rippling water? To be seen, or to be the means of sight? If she concealed herself in the art, where would she find her vanishing point? Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Lynn does have her books back there, Inland Sea and Killing Him. Killing Him makes a wonderful late Mother's Day present. So you really should get that and give it to your mom or mother figure in your life. Thank you again, Lynn. That was a wonderful reading. Let's give her another hand. We do have some wonderful authors coming up in the next month or so, including Michigan notable author Tim Schultz, who's going to be reading from his Michigan notable book about fly fishing in Montana. And if fly fishing doesn't appeal to you, it's also a really great meditation on nature, and it's got a very thorough quality to it. So I really recommend that you come for that one as well. And then at the end of June, we also have a historian who just published a book on Gray Verret. And so she's going to be up here talking about John Gray Verret Kaufman. I think that's the right name. I think I got that right. But anyway, that's at the end of June as well. So thank you for coming tonight. Hopefully we'll see you for Phil Lynch on Wednesday. And have a good night, everybody.